Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Limited Level Ups. So, I think everybody, at some point or another, through your limited journey, if you've been playing a while at least, we've had that format where, despite your best attempts, despite putting in some time, putting in some effort, doing your homework, so to speak, you just can't win, right? You can't buy a win. Every single draft you do, you're like, all right, 2 wins, 3 wins, maybe even less than that. And you start to think, okay, what am I doing wrong? Do I just suck at Magic now? Your brain might jump to the classic. No. It's the format that's wrong. I'm not bad. It's the format that just sucks. The format's got X, Y, Z problem. And, that format comes and goes. And in the next format, you start winning. In fact, it's one of your more winning formats, one of your more successful formats. I think this is something that a lot of players experience. So on today's episode, we're going to dive into some reasons why this happens, why some formats might click with you more than others do. And of course, being limited level ups, I want to share some thoughts about what you can do to break out of those losing streaks in those formats that don't immediately click with you. So let's jump in. So let's start with a question. And the question is, what makes a good limited player? I'm going to give you a second, pause the video, pause the podcast if you want to think about this, but just think, what are some things, maybe the main thing that makes a good limited player? So pause, answer coming in 3, 2, 1. And if you said that good players open up bombs in their rare slot and bad players open up lands and ley lines in theirs, then you are correct. That is the number one thing that is the most important to becoming a good limited player. If you don't open bombs some percentage of the time, I cannot help you there. But if you are somebody who opens up bombs some percentage of the time, I would say that there's not one singular thing, one singular factor or aspect that makes a good limited player. There are a lot of factors at play. And I think specifically, there's a lot of skills that you want to develop, a lot of skills that you want to embody if you want to become a really good limited player. And I think you can roughly divide those skills into two main groups, two main buckets here. Fundamental skills and what I'm calling toolbox skills. So your fundamental skills, these are the skills that no matter what limited format you're playing, these are going to be relevant. They're going to come up, and players with good fundamental skills are going to do better than players without these fundamental skills. These are the kind of skills that if you grew up listening to limited resources, or you've just heard a lot of the content on my channel, like the level up episodes, the format agnostic stuff, then you're probably going to have a decent idea of this kind of stuff. It's probably going to be ideas that you're familiar with. Some fundamental skills that I would say that good limited players exhibit are understanding role dynamics. So, it's the classic who's the beatdown kind of stuff in gameplay, mana base building, whether this be in a multicolor format or just a straightforward 2-color format. In either kind of format, mana base building is important. Can be a little more cerebral too. You can get into kind of abstract things such as learning from your losses. I think any good limited player goes, well, that sucks. That draft didn't go so well. That game, I stumbled a bit. Why did I lose? Was there a point in that game, in that draft, that I can learn from and take into my future drafts and start to do a little bit better? And then there's the other bucket of toolbox skills. And these are skills that might not apply to every single format. They might be skills that you have to exercise once every third format. Or maybe it's the case that more formats than not need you to have this skill to be successful. But there's one format where that skill doesn't need to be in your toolbox, and you might over-index on how important that might be. These are the format specifics. So, for example, I would say splashing, and this is a little bit different than mana base building, because it's the skill of deducing in the draft, is this worth splashing? Should I be multicolor, and do I have the power to be multicolor? Do I want to prioritize a bunch of lands? Should I just be a more straightforward 2-color deck? The balancing of costs of splashing and the reward of splashing when you're deck building. The current format, as I'm recording this episode, is Tarkir Dragonstorm, and I think this was a very, very relevant skill. Should you splash that 3-color card? Is it worth it? Maybe so, maybe not. So yeah, that's a question that comes up in most of my drafts when drafting Tarkir. Just should I add more colors to my deck? And in some formats, that's not the case at all. Some formats maybe just don't have very good fixing, or there's not incentive to really splash, where, an ideal deck in some formats is just, I'm 2 colors, I'm doing the thing that my color pair wants. I think recently Bloomburrow was a really good example of this, where, number one, there just wasn't that much fixing. Number two, if you were the green-white rabbit deck, well, you generally just wanted to take cards that were green and white and cared about rabbits and going wide. And if you were somebody who maybe liked to cook, liked to brew, you got your edges from out drafting a really synergistic deck, Bloomburrow might not have been your format. There's the other side of things where, there's formats that, sure, good cards are always going to matter. You have to know what the good cards are, but that's not enough, right? You then have to go the level 2, the level 3 of where do the not so good cards go? How do I make use of this common that I get 9th pick, 8th pick consistently? How do I set up certain engines in this format? Or maybe just the specifics of each color pair were very layered. I think Duskmourn was a very good example of this, where there were these engines. And if you're drafting Red Green Delirium, it's not just a beatdown deck, even though at its core it's a beatdown deck. You also have to balance card types and how to get cards in the grave and all that kind of stuff. Another example of a toolbox skill, or maybe like a pairing of toolbox skills, is being good at combat-centric gameplay versus being good at value-centric gameplay. So there's some formats where you're really rewarded if you have a great sense of who's the beatdown, and where's a good spot to use my combat trick? And when should I just attack all with all my creatures, even though 2 of them get eaten? Because, next turn I have a +2/+2 in flying combat trick, and that can finish off my opponent. Versus more value-centric gameplay, where the game you're trying to play is who's up the most cards at the end of the day. And how do I exchange resources with my opponent in the best way possible? Can I set up my value engine before my opponent sets up theirs? And, every format these days is going to have some amount of both of these things. There's no formats really anymore that are exclusively combat focused or exclusively late game grindy focused. They do a good job of balancing things to some degree. But there's definitely formats that lean one way or the other a little bit more. Another thing that can vary format to format is mechanics. So I know a lot of people had some trouble with the disguise mechanic from Murders at Karlov Manor. This is the mechanic where you can play a creature face down for 3 mana. It'll be a 2/2 with ward 2, and you can flip it up for whatever its disguise cost was. That's a hidden information mechanic. And that can be troublesome. That can be something that's really complex to track on board. If you're not somebody who has good onboard tracking skills, just being able to track, okay, all these things on board and figuring out, well, it could be this, it could be that, and deducing, well, it's not this disguised creature, because if it was, they would have flipped it up on this turn and eaten my creature in combat. That kind of stuff can be really tricky. Playing with hidden information, or playing on complex board states. There's some formats that have a lot of little trinkety things, right? Just like a lot of small artifacts that you might miss. Oh, they have that artifact that gives their creature +1/+1. Brothers War, I think, was a pretty good example of this, where there's a lot of little trinkety things going on. Even Ether Drift, I think, had some elements of this with just vehicles crowding up the battlefield. There are also going to be formats that just have some trickier to use mechanics. So I think back to Kamigawa Neon Dynasty with Ninjutsu. And Ninjutsu is a hard mechanic to play with and to play against, knowing when to block, when not to block, as the defending player. As the person with the Ninjutsu card, just knowing when you're supposed to bluff. And there's just like all these little kind of small things that are very Ninjutsu specific that, by the way, have really, I think, burned their way into many a player's brain. That feeling of the post Ninjutsu format, the format right after you have a format with Ninjutsu in it. You get that little feeling when your opponent attacks and the creature goes unblocked, and you're like, oh wait, no. They can't Ninjutsu something. Those cards don't exist anymore. So yeah, all of this is just to say, well, there are, I think, a lot of fundamental skills that you can take into any format that will be relevant in any draft, any game you play. And you kind of think of these as like, okay, this is what makes a good limited player. If I can get good at these things, then I'll be good at most formats. At the same time, there are a lot of these toolbox skills that you have to sometimes reach into your skill toolbox and say, I'm going to use this one in this format. And I don't have to use it as much in the other formats. You can kind of think of it like a skill check, like a D&D skill check, where it's like, all right, here's that format. Do you have this skill, player? And if not, then, that the format might really chew you up and spit you out. Every player also has their own preferences, whether they know about them or not, like their own biases based on what they enjoy in Magic, based on what they've had success with in the past, based on how they've learned Magic, based on what content they might listen to. They have their own decision-making processes. People approach problem solving differently. Every format is going to ask different toolbox skills of you. And when those skills line up with the ones you're naturally good at, you have experience with, lean into your strengths, you do very well in those formats, right? Those are the formats that you go, hey, this is easy. What's coming to me naturally kind of lines up with what I need to do in this format. And then there's formats that you're just going to fail the skill check and you go, oh man, why am I losing? These fundamentals that I've trained so hard on, they're not doing me any good here. Yeah, the reason you're probably failing in that specific limited format is it tests a skill that you're not quite there on, or you might not even be aware of. I think, to wrap this section up, the best players, they have good fundamentals, extremely solid fundamentals, but they also have a really large toolbox of skills, and they know when to take out certain tools to apply them when appropriate. Not only can they use them, but they can deduce what kind of skills are important for a format. That's kind of a skill in its own. So yeah, if we know that different formats ask different things of you, and certain players are sort of biased towards certain things and have certain skills, I think then it becomes a question of self-identification, of going, okay, well, what kind of player am I? What kind of formats might give me some trouble? And what kind of formats might I excel in? So you might be familiar with Mark Rosewater's player psychographics, and this is like a Wizards thing where when they're designing cards, they kind of think, okay, who is this card for? Who are we designing this card for? And there's these three main psychographics, these like three types of players that they think of. They think of the Timmy player who likes big creatures and big effects, the Johnny player who cares about combos and how cards interact, and the Spike player who just wants to win at all costs, wants, very powerful cards and tournament playable cards, those kind of things. And so I've kind of come up with some limited psychographics, just some player archetypes that I think you can kind of go, hey, that's me, or I kind of identify with this. And for each of them, I'm going to kind of go over their strengths and weaknesses and where they might have blind spots and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so first player type here is the Synergist. And for each of these player types, I've kind of pulled aside a player that I think fits into these, either like a content creator or a pro. And for the Synergist, we've got my good friend Ethan Sachs, Lords Limited. And Ethan is definitely a Synergist. So the Synergists, they love finding synergies, obviously. They really open a pack and they go, okay, I take the best card, but then what plays well with it? And a lot of times they'll use some kind of interesting, not typically good cards, right? Some really kind of like, wow, you're playing that card? Oh, come on, playing that card because it plays really well with these three cards, right? Their brains are very good at piecing together small synergies, how cards play well together. I think that excites somebody like Ethan a lot, just figuring out like, okay, how can I get incremental value out of these two cards? And, how can I set up this loop where over the course of 3 turns, I'll net like a card and a half or something like that, right? And other things that Synergist loves, they love decks with specific plans. So we're not just talking about A plus B synergies where it's like, oh, hey, column A, I've got my Eerie cards, and column B, I've got my Eerie Payoffs, my enchantments. We're talking about decks where every card in them counts, almost like a Rube Goldberg machine, right? Where every single card, you'd really have a tough time cutting one of them. It's like, well, if I cut this card, then these 3 cards get a lot worse. And it seems like every card has a place. And if you look at Ethan's draft decks in normal formats, but also in Cube, it really feels like that. I think Cube really exemplifies this if you ever watch him draft Cube. But it's like a well-oiled machine that he slowly built up with sometimes good cards and sometimes not so great cards. Ethan is a lover of the companion mechanic. I think I remember him saying like these are his all-time favorite cards in Limited, or some of his all-time favorite cards in Limited. So getting to play a good Luris deck or a Karuga deck, right? That's really what gets the Synergist going. Another thing about the Synergist is they generally care more about the words than the numbers on a card, or pay more attention to the words than the numbers, which is to say that they're not as concerned about, okay, on rate, how good is this card? Am I getting what I'm paying for my mana? Because a lot of times, they're not that focused on just playing their cards on curve and just curving out with them and they'll just get the job done. They're worried about setting up engines, right? Going for the long game. And I know a good example here, if you think way back to Brothers War, if you played that format, Clay Revenant was a card that Ethan, I remember, he really, really liked this card for various reasons. So this is the single mana 1/2, enters the battlefield tapped. You can pay 3 mana to return it from your graveyard to your hand. And, there was a red-black sacrifice deck in that format. This is the exact kind of card I'm talking about where it's like, okay, I'm going to loop this and over the course of 3 turns get like a card and a half worth of value. And if you just look at the card, right, just like the raw stats, you're getting 1 mana for a 1/2. You wouldn't really play that without other abilities. And I think, barring other context, right, like that Ethan, of course, is considering here, you would never play 1 mana 1/2, pay 3, return that from the graveyard to your hand. Like, the rate on that card is just not good enough. But the words of, oh, okay, well, this is a thing that if I mill, I can get it back. And, if I can discard it for some value, I can do some good things with that. That's how the Synergist brain works. And if you are somebody like this, here are some places you might struggle. You might struggle with good stuff formats that are just like, well, This is a multicolor format. Dominaria United is a good example. I think that Tarkir Dragon's Realm is a good example, where mostly the goal is like, let's just, get all these strong cards into our deck. And there are some synergies here and there, of course, but mostly I think that strong decks have strong cards in them. Earlier in this format, I remember Ethan was talking about this on his podcast. He was just like, yeah, not that into Tarkir. It kind of feels like, there's kind of just the two big decks, Boros and the 5-color decks, and sure, yeah, there are synergies, but really, you don't have a ton of wiggle room. It's kind of just like, okay, let's just see how many good cards I can get and shove them into my deck. And so, your brain, if you're a synergist, does not appreciate that kind of gameplay, right? It's not stimulated by it. It might not enjoy it. And I think that, by the way, plays a big part in doing well in formats, just like your enjoyment. Because if you're enjoying a format, then you'll want to play it more. And you get that positive feedback loop. You get that reinforcement like, yeah, I'm doing well and I want to do even better. And if it doesn't line up with what you like, then you don't really have the motivation and you're probably not doing so well. So yeah, good stuff formats the synergist kind of struggles in. Also might struggle in a format where there's a lot of removal and the removal is strong removal. Because the synergist really wants to set up these engines. They want to set up this card plus this card plus this card. And you know what's really good against those kind of engines? Removal spells, right? If they can just interact with your board and you have this like 4-card, 3-card interaction and one of them dies and the other 3 don't do anything, well, your whole puzzle falls apart. Next type of player is the curve out gamer. And I've got DeFore to represent the curve out gamer. Couldn't think of anybody better. And the curve out gamer cares about tempo. They care about stats. They care about the early game. They're the type of person who just wants to go, I'm going to put my stuff on board and let's just hope it's good enough. I think they generally care about the numbers on the cards more than they care about the words on the cards. So the opposite of the synergist, the curve out gamer is looking like, okay, what am I getting for my 1 mana? I'm getting 2/1 worth of stats. That's pretty good for my 1 mana. What else? Not that they don't care about abilities. There's a good example here, Descendant of Storms, the single white mana 2/1. The whenever you attack, you pay 2 and it endures 1. Not that those words don't matter, but a big part of this card, if you ask DeFore, is that it's a 1 mana 2/1, and that really matters a lot. And of course, the ability gives you more stats. That really matters a lot. Does DeFore care about it as much to, care about counters for the counter deck? Not really. Does he care about it for the go wide aspect of the go wide deck? For sure, absolutely. But it's not the main reason the card's good. For struggles that the curve out gamer might face, the curve out gamer, they might struggle in long games. And by the way, for all these people that I'm bringing up, I'm not saying they necessarily had these struggles, but people like them might have these struggles. Not to say they also might not have them, but long games are tough, right? Especially if you're like thinking, okay, well, I'm going to just be playing my thing. I'm hoping it's good enough. Because most of the time when you're just evaluating cards for your deck individually and saying like, okay, well, I really hope this does its thing on turn 2, that usually means there's no other cards or not many other cards you're considering. Like, I need to have this card in my hand to make my 2 mana 2/2 with an ability good. It's just going to be good on its own. So as the game goes longer, this isn't necessarily even saying like, oh, these players are more prone to aggro, which I think is true. But as the game goes longer, their cards might not have as much synergy with each other because one of the main reasons they selected a certain card in the draft was, when I cast this, it's just going to be good. These type of players also might struggle to navigate complex board states, or might struggle in formats where 2-drops just aren't that strong. Aether Drift, I think, was a really, really good example of this, where, it's not like the 2-drops didn't matter, but I know a lot of people had a lot of trouble in Aether Drift early on because they were playing too many 2-drops, too many irrelevant 2-drops, too many 2-drops that just did not matter as the game went on. And if you're a player who spends most of their time in game in the first, 1 to 6 turns, like that's where you're playing most of your games, the skill of navigating more complex board state might be difficult because you might not end up finding yourself in those spots. And when you do find yourself in those spots, the kind of stalled out boards, that might be a failure state actually for your deck, because a lot of times, all these curve out decks, those tend to correlate with the aggro decks more often than not. And so again, not only are your cards just going to be less good in those kind of board states, but you might not have the experience of what to do once you get to that kind of board state. All right, next up is the value gamer. And who else could I put in the spot than LSV himself? So the value gamer loves drawing cards, loves games that go long, loves extracting value out of every inch of the card they can. They love attrition, they love trading, getting good exchanges on their cards, 2-for-1s, and they like decision trees, right? They really, in my experience, a lot of players who are like this, they like this style of gameplay because they feel that as the game goes on and it goes for longer and longer and longer, more turns, there will be more decisions available to them. and they believe that they will be able to make the right decision more often than their opponent, right? You often see this in very, very long games where the good player, they won't flinch. They won't falter. They're just waiting for their opponent to make one little mistake, and then they can really get them, right? Stabilize and then really, really get them. And I think that very much applies to how LSP likes to draft. The value gamer may struggle with fast formats or with bombs. So, the fast format one, that makes sense. If the format's very fast or medium fast, your divination, your card draw might not be as good as it is in some other formats. It might be very difficult to outvalue the opponent because you just die before that happens. But also, the value gamer might struggle with bomb-heavy formats because if your plan is make the game go long, make the game go long, make the game go long, and hopefully I'm advantaged when that game goes long, well, if it's a format where most people have like 2 to 3 very good rares in their deck, there's just a lot of good rares running around, then the advantage that they gain from making the game go long might be completely negated just by one good rare coming down. And so that can be frustrating for the value gamer. They did all this work and it's like, one card invalidated my entire game plan. Also, a common mistake I see with people, upcoming value gamers, the apprentice value gamer, is they may try to squeeze out value when it's not right to do. Right, so they'll at all costs just say like, my card needs to do the max possible. I'm not gonna play out my card unless I can get the max possible value. So where that might manifest is you have a card. Yeah, let's use a Tarkir example. The Envoy, the green Envoy. I can't remember the exact name, but it's the 4 mana green creature. It's a 4/3. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card if you have a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, and if you don't, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Envoy. Well, the value gamer, they really want that card. They really just say, okay, I gotta get all that value I can, and even though they might be getting beaten down a little bit, and it would just be good to put a 4 mana 5/4 on the board at that point, they wait. And that might be a mistake, right? That's kind of a trap you can walk into. It's kind of the misevaluation of what's important in the game, right? The value gamer is very much on the value end of the spectrum, less so on the tempo end of the spectrum, where sometimes in a lot of games, tempo just might be the thing you need. The last player type I have is the flex drafter, and I've got Sam Black here as a good example of the flex drafter. I think out of the 4 types, I kind of fit into this one most. I most identify with this one myself. So some qualities of the flex drafter. They can brew, right? Sort of like the synergist as well, but they're very like, okay, what are the cards being thrown at me? What can I do with them? They're very flexible to just thinking on the spot and adjusting their plan. They're not the type that's going to go into a draft and be like, okay, I'm going to draft this and draft that today, right? They really just want to see what's going to come to me. And I think they get a lot of enjoyment out of that puzzle. A lot of drafters kind of feel stressed by that. They go, oh, there's so many options. Like, I really just want to be, in that lane, in that kind of lane where I can know what my deck is going to look like by the end and build towards that. I have a blueprint of what my final deck wants to look like, and I can pick up the pieces along the way. The flex drafter is the exact opposite of that. And I think the flex drafter is very good at reading packs and figuring out what they should do, given their position, given their seat in the draft. Not just figuring out, okay, well, these colors are open and I should move into them. It's not exactly that. It's also pairing that with what did I take early and what do those cards want? And how much do they mesh or clash with the things that are actually open at this table? I think the flex drafter adapts very well. One thing that I say a lot is when you're navigating drafts, you want to be thinking every single pick, and then what? And then what? And then what, right? It's not just, okay, I take some cards and I end up roughly in some space and I can take cards that roughly go in that, dragon space or teamer space or whatever it is. You really want to say, okay, until the draft is done, I need to readjust every single pick of this draft and adapt to what I see, what's coming to me. Flex Drafter might find some struggles in formats where archetypes are very rigid. So this is formats like Bloomburrow, where the archetypes are very much just like, all right, like I said before, you're drafting green-white, you're drafting rabbits, you know what you should take. You should roughly take cards that are rabbits and care about going wide. When there's not a lot of room for skill expression in the format, which is to say, hey, I can draft the deck better than the average player, I think. If that's one of the skills that you feel like gives you an edge, well, in a format like Bloomburrow, where it's much more on rails, you're going to lose that edge a little bit. And in those formats, gameplay matters a lot more generally than the draft, I find. So with those 4 player types, you might resonate with some of those. You might take some aspects of different ones and say, okay, I'm a little bit of the flex drafter plus a little bit of the curve out gamer, or I'm a little bit of the synergist plus the curve out gamer. I guess those don't have as much overlap, but yeah, you might take bits and parts of each of these psychographics and say, hey, yeah, that's me. The question then becomes, what do you do with that information? And if you can put yourself in a box, especially if you identify very strongly with one of these types of drafters, is that a good thing? You might intuitively think, well, I don't want to be typecast as a drafter, as a player, as a limited player. Maybe I should be branching out to broaden my horizons, to acquire a few more skills from these other types of drafters that I don't necessarily flex. And I think there's definitely merit to that, absolutely. The other side of the argument is the Sam Black local maxima argument, which basically, if you haven't listened to Sam's content, Sam talks about this sometimes, where the idea is every player has a local maxima, which is their strengths, the things they're good at. And if you are looking to perform well in a given event, in a given draft, then it very much benefits you to say, I'm going to lean into that thing that I'm good at. If you want to view this in the lens of 17 lands compared to any given player, you could draft based on game in hand win rate on 17 lands. Say, I'm just going to take the best card, game in hand win rate. But that might not lead you to a good deck. Well, it probably won't, number one. But even if it were to lead the average player to a good deck, it wouldn't lead a individual player to necessarily a good deck, because it doesn't exactly jive with what they're good at and the play patterns they're used to, and basically just, their experience and what they've been good at the past. And so I think the way you want to kind of reconcile this of like, well, yeah, of course, if I lean into my strengths and I can win individual drafts more often in a given draft, versus, well, that might be true, but I might be missing this big wide world of other things I could be good at. And there might be more options presented to me in drafts that I'm not taking because I don't have experience. Maybe I'm a bit gun shy about those things. Ultimately, my answer is it depends what your goals are. Because if your goals are to get better long term, to say like, hey, I'm not exactly where I want to be as a limited player. I do feel like I'm much more, I only draft the aggro decks. I only draft the curve out decks. I'm not so good at drafting the complicated, the synergist decks. Then you might want to say to yourself, okay, I'm going to put in the work. I'm going to, watch some content from people that are kind of more of that player. I'm going to say when I open a funky rare or get past a funky rare, I'll jump in a little more often. I'll get some experience, because I do believe over the long term, more tools in your tool belt, right? Going back to the whole toolbox skills, more toolbox skills in your toolbox will mean, yeah, you will be better in a wide variety of situations, or in a wider variety of situations. But if, let's say, you care very much about winning a specific draft, and this could be the Arena Open, it could be just a draft where you're like, hey, I've lost a few in a row, and, my gems are kind of going down the drain. Let me see if I can kind of just stick with what I know. Then for sure, stick with your local maxima, because that in an individual instance of that event, you're going to, on average, win more with what you're familiar with. So yeah, depends on your goals. It really does. I imagine if you've made it this far in this episode, you're somebody who probably wants to get better long term. So I would suggest, if you have the opportunities, try to branch out, especially if you're somebody who's clicked on this episode and went, hey, there's been a few formats in the past few years that I just sucked at, and I'm not sure why. This can maybe point you in the right direction. And let's take a quick trip to Patreon plugland, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. If you're enjoying the show, if you enjoy any of my content, go check that out. The number one place you can go to support my content. Really, really does help me keep doing what I love doing each week. And there's also a bunch of benefits over there, right? There's coaching benefits, there's draft log review help, there's deck tech help, all that kind of stuff. Also, if you are looking for a community of like-minded people that want to get better at Limited, there's the Limited Level Ups Discord. It's a free Discord. Links to both those things, the Patreon and the Discord, are in the YouTube box down below, the description, and also the podcast description. So go check those links out if those things sound like they're interesting to you. If you want to support the channel in a non-monetary way, a like, a subscribe, and a comment on the video goes a really long way too. All right. Back to the show. So let's get into some practical advice here. So you find yourself in a format where you're not doing too well, and something I think is pretty common is trying to figure out, okay, is it just variance here, or is this a format that maybe something's not clicking with me, maybe I don't understand, maybe I'm building decks a little bit wrong here. Kind of want to run down, when I have experienced that kind of stuff, the things that I feel. So number one, and this is, by the way, the whole idea with this section is going to be, how do you deduce, is this just variance, or am I doing something wrong, or is this format, is the skills that it rewards maybe not exactly in line with what I'm naturally good at? So number one, when you draft a deck or consistently draft decks where you at the end of the draft, you go, yeah, this looks like a pretty good deck, but the decks don't do well, right? You can, it's one thing to say, hey, my instincts tell me that a good limited Magic deck should look like X, Y, and Z. It's another thing to put it into practice and say, oh, okay, well, actually X, Y, and Z didn't actually pan out the way I expected it to. And maybe a few of those things that I thought were good, for example, having 8 or 9, 10 2-drops are not actually that good in this format. Basically, once you've drafted a deck that you feel like is pretty good, when you jump into the games, ask yourself, are your good cards actually performing well? Are they doing impactful things? Do they line up well with what the opponent's doing? If that's not the case, then you just might not have a very good deck. You might not have very good cards. So an example I'd give is Red, White, and Aether Drift. Right, the red-white vehicle deck that didn't really come together, was not one of the good decks in that format. I could see a deck you drafted where you've just got all the golden commons, and the golden common in that format, or one of them was really strong actually. It was the 2-mana 3/1 that when you could tap it and it made a pilot token for each vehicle or mount that entered this turn. Great card. When we reviewed that set, we were like, yeah, this is a phenomenal card. It's like an A- or something. And you draft that card, you put it in your deck. And it turns out that, oh, hey, it's just not working out the way I thought, because maybe either I'm playing too many vehicles in this deck to make this card work, and that just isn't a successful strategy. Or maybe I made one pilot over the course of a turn or two, but that actually didn't matter versus the big green dummies that my opponents had. So you really have to be honest, right? And part of this is going in to a format and having, whatever expectations you have about how good cards are going to be, throwing that out the window, or putting a much lower emphasis on your initial impressions compared to how the cards are actually playing out. Another thing might just be when you're drafting, you're unsure about what cards to take. This isn't necessarily saying you can't find what the good cards in the pack are, but you don't know, okay, am I supposed to take this threat, or am I supposed to take this removal spell? Is ramp good in this format? I don't know. It was good in last format, but maybe you don't know the factors that might make it good or bad in certain formats. Or you might say, like, this ramp spell looks like the ramp spell from the previous format, but in practice it's actually much, much worse. Maybe you draft a deck that's very removal heavy, but it so happens that the format is not very kind to removal piles, right? There's a lot of enter the battlefield effect creatures. I think you're really just looking for that funny feeling, right? Where you feel like, something's not quite right here. And it requires a bit of humility, I think. A lot of Magic players have the tendency to think that their opinion is right. Sometimes not even consciously, right? Like, sometimes consciously, but sometimes they just think, like, I know this about Magic. I believe this to be true. It will always be true. And it can be tough to move off of that, right? It can be tough to break from heuristics. This especially matters in modern day limited, where card evaluation is just different, right? So 10, 15 years ago, a 4-mana 3/3 flyer, that would be a really solid card in any format. And, if you're just coming back to the game after 5 years or something, then you might not know that the 4-mana 3/3 flyer with a little bit of an ability, we have that in Tarkir, the white 4-mana 3/3 that has mobilized one. You might think, wow, that looks like a strong card. But turns out that, that kind of card is just not what it used to be. It's not the kind of card I'm really looking to put in my deck these days. When you're in game, I think it's good to just note, okay, well, if I'm casting my cards on curve, I'm not stumbling on my mana, I'm generally, I'm making good combat decisions, I think, and my cards still aren't working out, that's probably indicative of either the cards you have aren't as good as you thought, or maybe you're missing a key part to the deck that you just weren't aware that was very, very important. And once you do kind of feel like, okay, something's not right here, it's not clicking, what are some things you can do? Well, I would always suggest, looking at 17 lands for just raw, how good are these cards generally, on average, right? That always is very illuminating, I find. A lot of my coaching sessions, early in formats, where the person's like, I'm not doing so well in the format. They kind of, like I described, are kind of uneasy in the draft. They're not sure exactly what kind of cards they should take. We just take a few minutes and we go through and I ask them, hey, we should just go through, look at the 17 lands, just like game in hand win rate, or the nice chart that they have now, and say, are there any surprises here to you? are there any cards where you're like, wow, that I didn't expect that card to be so good, or I didn't expect that card to be so bad? And we can kind of talk through, why that might be the case. And, this helps if you have a friend, of course. But even if you're just by yourself, just go, huh, okay, well, I'm going to use that 4-mana 3/3 flyer as an example. Like, oh, okay, well, that, maybe that card's just a lot worse than I thought. So you can see some patterns, right? Just like set to set. Like, that's something you can figure out by your own. Just going, well, set after set after set, this 4-mana 3/3 flyer is not performing very well, or the cards that are 4-mana 3/3 flyers. So maybe that just means that these cards on a baseline are no longer the kind of cards I'm looking for, right? You can kind of deduce things like that. I think one thing to ask yourself, if you find yourself drafting the same deck that isn't performing very well, and you find yourself in it, well, one reason you might find yourself in it very often is it's not a very good deck, right? Nobody else at the table wants it, and maybe some people know that, and you might not. So I think it's good to ask yourself, am I getting pushed into this deck consistently? Am I getting bullied into drafting a deck that I don't really want to draft? There's always push and pull, right? Between drafting a deck that you would like to draft and that is strong and lines up with your preferences, and drafting just what the table gives you. And I would say, generally what I've seen is the trend is that less experienced players, they do let the table push them around a little bit, right? Like they're the kind of player where they're at the level where it's like, oh, I understand that I'm supposed to read signals. I understand that I'm supposed to figure out what other people are doing. And then they go into, for example, in Tarkir, maybe some sort of black deck, because the last cards in the pack they saw were all, the crappy black cards. Like, well, nobody else is doing this. It doesn't really matter if nobody else is doing it if that deck isn't very good. And I think you can broadly apply that to basically any format. Just be like, well, am I ending up in a deck because I have intention to be in it? I've been an active participant of this draft, and I said, like, I'm taking these cards for this reason. Or did most of my picks result from just like, well, that was the best card in the pack, and maybe I didn't really want to take it, but I didn't really see another option. Always kind of a tricky thing to figure out, right? There's like a lot of push and pull there. It's not exactly a binary thing. But if a format's not clicking for you and you keep ending up with decks that aren't performing very well, part of it might just be that you're not invoking the agency that you could be in a draft, not trying to carve out your lane a little bit more often, and not letting the draft just push you around, bully you around. So if you have figured out, hey, I'm doing something wrong here, and this format's not clicking with me, not lining up with my strengths as a player, what can you do from there, right? What are some strategies? So one thing I would suggest is channel one of those archetypes, right? Channel one of those player archetypes. Say, if I was Ethan in this situation, what would I do? WWDD, what would DeFord do? That's right? The WWDD, what would DeFord do? And I think that can really help, right? It can kind of break you out of your own biases, break you out of your own patterns. That really helps, because clearly if you're not winning, something needs to change, and your current intuition is not right. So it kind of helps to borrow somebody else's intuition, I think. Of course, some of this is you can watch those people play. DeFore, Paul Cheon, myself, Numa, we're posting gameplay videos a lot of the time. Me a little bit less often than I'd like to, but there's a lot of people out there that you can intuitively learn from just by watching what they do. You can piggyback off of their strategies. You can piggyback off of like, well, if I'm Paul Cheon in this spot, what card do I take here? I think that really does help. I think if you're somebody who plays formats for their duration, somebody who sees the whole life cycle of a format, what I would suggest is after the first 2 weeks, where, the first 2 weeks generally is like the easy money, right? Where you're like, okay, like the good cards are coming my way. Not everybody knows what the good cards are. After the 2 weeks, it gets a little bit harder. I would really suggest that you try to draft decks that you haven't drafted before, just to get the experience, right? So for Tarkir, if you were only drafting the green decks or the Boros decks week 1, maybe even just one of those kind of decks, right? I would say, okay, try to see what blue-red feels like, what Jeskai feels like. Try to see what green-blacks feels like. Because if you never feel what those decks are like, and you never feel like what a good version of that deck will look like, it's really, really difficult to see the vision of like when you should be going for it. You could also just look on 17 lands, look at the trophies, like, well, what does a successful green-black deck look like? What does a successful Jeskai deck look like? That helps a lot too. You don't have to spend your gems, and that's one of the things, right? A lot of this getting better and the practicing. Of course, I don't want to downplay the fact that it comes at the cost of spending money, spending gems. There's a lot of tools that you can use though that don't cost you anything. 17 lands, talking to other people, that you can get the experience of drafting these other decks. But if you're somebody who maybe doesn't care, you feel like you've got a decent bankroll of gems, yeah, I would just say, like, one night, just say, like, hey, tonight I opened up a rare that pushes me down the green-black aggro path. Let's just try it. Let's see what it's like. It's kind of the same thing I was talking about, the sand-black local maxima kind of thing, where it's like, okay, well, you might be pretty good at drafting these decks, but those kind of decks aren't always going to be open. You still need to broaden your horizons. Exploration versus exploitation might be another way to put that. Ultimately, being good at limited is a tough thing, and you're not going to be the best player in every single format. You see this with the best players out there, right? All those players that I just mentioned, they have formats that don't click with them. They have formats just like, yeah, not my format. This is something that all players experience, unless you're Ekin. Ekin, who is the, always like 70% win rate in best of one on 17 lands. Somehow that person just knows how to navigate every single format. But yeah, unless you're Ekin listening to this podcast, it's going to happen to you. You're going to have formats that are less good. Line up less with your intuition of what makes a good limited Magic deck. Again, if you're somebody who's still listening to this podcast at this point, I would imagine you want to get better, and it's so easy. It's so easy to just be like, it's this format. This format, that's the problem. I wish this format was more like this. I wish this deck didn't exist. That's fine. You can have those wishes. Absolutely. But as far as just like direct, how do I get better? How do I ascend from that and be like, actually, I'm doing pretty well in this format that I wasn't doing so well? I think, all the things we mentioned today do play a really big part. And of course, the more formats you play, the better you are at the next one. The more tools you have, right? The more skills you can hone. I often like to think of it as different formats hone different skills, and they give you more tools for future formats. Even if you have a format that you didn't do so well in, at the end of the format, after you've done, your 10, 20, 30 drafts, whatever it is, maybe it's 50, maybe it's 100. After you've done all the drafts you're going to do, just say, okay, what did I learn from this format? What did it actually teach me? Did it teach me how to build a better mana base? Did it teach me some rules and build some intuition about tempo and when to, use my removal spell just to get a blocker out of the way? Was that something that I did very often in this format? What did I get punished by often in this format? Maybe I don't do that as often in formats that are like this. Maybe I don't fire off my removal spell on their dorky 4-mana 4/4, and instead, in a format that has a lot of good 6 and 7 mana cards, I save my removal spell for that thing. I think Tarkir are a good example of that. You didn't usually want to fire off your removal spell to their ground creatures. You really wanted to hit their dragons, because those things killed you quickly. They often have pretty good abilities. You can kind of apply that to other formats. So if we have another format in the future, where it is sort of like that, where there are these big monsters in some way or another. Maybe it's an angel set or something. They try to redo Avacyn Restored after the first time didn't go so well for limited. Or there's a set like Theros. The original Theros is like this, where you were building up to these big monsters with the monstrous mechanic. So you can say this format taught me to hold my removal for the important cards, and you can apply those to various formats where that might apply. And then you can say the opposite too. You can do the inverse of that, where you go, well, this format's all about the cheap stuff. I should kill the cheap stuff and not hold on to my heuristics of what I did last format in Tarkir. Let's say Final Fantasy is all about cheap stuff, right? Don't hold on to that removal spell for some good 7-drop or 6-drop, because it might not exist. It might be that 4-mana 4/4 might be the important card to kill. And you can say that when you know the format better, and you go, hey, I don't usually die to 6 and 7 mana cards in this format. I'm fine to fire off my removal spell so I can interact early so I don't die. Anyways, thank you so much for watching and listening. This was a little bit more of an abstract episode than we usually do, so hope you found it helpful. Hope you had a little more confidence for this kind of thing. And we're coming up very quickly to the Final Fantasy set review. So I just finalized details of this today with Mark, my set review partner. And I think what we're going to do is we're mostly for this set, because it's pretty complex, there's a lot of words, there's a lot of cards, we're going to go back to the original format we had of uncommons and commons one day, rares, mythic another day. We're still going to keep Mark's archetypes that he likes to talk about. They're looking at the archetype skeletons, that's going to stay. But we really did want to cover all the cards this time. So we're going to do that. I'm going to post dates and stuff for all that stuff on the channel and in the Discord very soon. So look forward to that. Thank you for watching and listening. If you made it this far, like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.